Okay, well, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for coming to my presentation. So this is a presentation which attempts to give an answer to the question as to why the gold standard actually emerged, which of course is a topic which has been debated for quite some time, but I'm putting forward a new case, a new rationale, as it were. Now, it is a question which certainly has aroused quite some controversy in the past, and the extreme point of views, just to show the variety, as it were, range between historical inevitability, which is an argument put forward by Kindleberger many years ago, and on the other hand, a sort of accident of history story, which is best captured by the work of Marc Flandreau. And Flandreau's argument here is really that a continuation of the triangular system as we had it in the 1850s and 60s between gold, silver, and bimetallism would have been easily possible. Now, what I'm trying to do here is to draw on a large number of monetary commissions of the 1860s and to see what they can tell us. If you look at the existing literature, certainly some of them have been studied, but there's very much a focus on one country or only a small number of countries only. And I think when you then go on and look at the findings of the literature, what you will often find is that the reasons suggested for switching to the gold standard actually reflect reasons which were important at a later period, namely after 1873, as I will try to explain in the following. Now, when you cannot answer the question why it emerged, perhaps let's ask ourselves, when did it emerge, and approach the question of why this way. And what you see on this figure here fairly clearly is that, so this gives you a number of European and non-European countries joining the gold standard, and what you see there is a certain density at 1871, 72, 73. So it is often said that the gold standard emerged in 1873, which is also the point of view that I take. However, what is important to note, so these countries are given here in chronological order, is that actually Germany, which is often seen as the first country in the 1870s to join, was actually not the first one when you look at it closer. So there were a couple of countries joining the gold standard before the 1870s, and that will become important as I develop my argument. Now, so let's say that is that 12 countries and their respective monetary commissions, which I'm studying in this paper. And let me now put forward my basic case, my hypothesis, and then let me try to develop it. So the first point I want to make is that the debate on the monetary standard really differed fundamentally before and after 1873. This is a paper concerned with pre-1873. After 1873, I very much follow, let's say, the Border-Rogoff story or the Meissner story, which says that it's a lot about network externalities. Countries joined the gold standard because their main trading partners were on it. Country joined the gold standard so as to obtain capital at better conditions. This is a paper about 1860 to 1873. And what we see in this period is a pan-European movement in favor of gold monometallism due to basically four reasons. Well, the first one is gold is for the first time ever actually available in a sufficiently large quantity to base a world monetary system on gold alone. Secondly, there were widespread misgivings over the workings of bimetallism in all countries that followed one or the other way a bimetallic system. Thirdly, there was an issue of coin convenience. Countries started dreaming of a gold standard complemented by silver token coinage rather than a bimetallic system in which both metals would be coined as full-bodied coins. And last but not least, what countries really wanted was the French coinage system without the link to bimetallism. So in a sense, this is still a story about network externalities. It is just that I think so far we haven't gotten the network quite right to which countries aspired. Now perhaps to put my work in slightly sharper relief to other work on that topic, let me make a couple of additional points. This is work which tries to reduce the importance of the early English gold standard adoption. I introduce far less importance to that. Equally, I just don't think that the German transition in 1873 was as important or even crucial as it is often seen in the literature. And last but not least, I think this is also work which aims to reduce the importance of the increased world silver supply starting in the late 1960s. The third point is still somewhat important for the work I want to do, but I don't think that silver is as crucial as it is portrayed, for instance, by Kindleberger. Now, when you look into the literature for the transition to the gold standard, there are really three conventional explanations. I would normally quite go into detail with all of them, but I don't think we have the time for that. But let me still just mention them. So one theory is network externalities. Countries join the gold standard to increase trade or to increase more capital. Then there is a big strand of the literature which argues in favor of ideological motivations. And that's basically a story of countries trying to emulate best practice as practiced by the richest country of the day, which was, of course, the United Kingdom. And then there is a story of a tipping point, and they pay a lot of attention to the German decision to join the gold standard in 1873, and Germany in itself is said to have been motivated by the English example. Now, there is a lot in the paper on each of these three and why I don't think they are quite right, but I don't think I can go through all of that. Perhaps in the Q&A session we can address some issues in case there are questions. I think the way I would like to start is really to ask that very simple question: what actually determined the use of a specific metal in the 19th century or at earlier periods? And I think basically what we find is that very many different metals were used in the past, but by and large you can really put them in three categories. There is silver, which determined the transactions of daily life. Well, then you have gold, which was always much more valuable than silver, and as a result gold was by and large confined to the settlement of large amounts of money, often involving long distances. Well, and then you have some other metals which chemists still consider as precious metals, or at least some of them are they. But they are not precious enough in the sense that if you coin them, they would often be very heavy and bulky if you really wanted to pay something very meaningful for that. So that is true for copper, iron, nickel, or bronze. And they were mainly used when neither gold nor silver were available. Sweden in the 17th century would be a classical case for that. Now, with gold and silver then taking the prominent role, there were principally three solutions for a monetary system. Well, the first one was you could go for the gold standard, which is what England did fairly early on, but actually until 1854, when Portugal joined the gold standard, England was the only country to operate a gold standard. What most European countries did is they did base their monetary system on silver, but they also introduced trade coins which took then the form of gold. And then there was the third option, and that was to have bimetallism, which was often at the rate, so the French set the tone at the rate of 1 to 15.5 in their 1803 legislation. But what happened in many periods, certainly in the first half of the 19th century, was a situation by which gold was worth on the open market much more than in the legal ratio. So gold left monetary circulation, and essentially until the 1850s there is no doubt that the French system was essentially a silver standard, even though legislation was bimetallic. And this system then spreads due to the Napoleonic Wars to a number of neighboring countries, which henceforth develop an interest in staying close to the French system, both in terms of metals chosen as well as far as the coinage system is concerned. Now, and here really starts the story. The thing that really changes in the late 1840s and early 1850s is the fact that gold is mined in large quantities in two parts of the world, that is in California and in Australia. And so this is a diagram which shows you, according to some of the best calculations we have, the ones by Sothbaer, going back gold production from the times of Columbus to the early 20th century. Now you really see the quantum leap of gold production due to the gold findings in these two places. And that, in my view, really changes the overall picture. And let's run through that step by step. What happens? Well, the first thing that you would expect to happen is for the gold-silver exchange rate to change. So I said earlier that in this period back here, as it were, the ratio was continuously above the French legal ratio of 15.5 to 1, and that then changes. Now, and what that means, if it drops below 15.5 to 1, is of course that gold, step by step, is going to replace silver in the circulation of countries that operate bimetallism. So what we see is that the world monetary system is getting ever more gold through the bimetallic block, if you like. At the same time, you have a big discussion starting whether gold is actually still a stable metal. So it's not by definition that gold is always more stable than silver. It simply depends on the relative quantities. And in the 1850s, there are lots of discussions on the monetary standard, discussions which are mostly forgotten really, but discussions which boil down to saying, is gold still the right metal? In England, you have a substantial discussion on whether England should leave the gold standard and go over to silver for precisely that reason. Key is really what happens in the bimetallic countries. As I said, the bimetallic countries, for their arbitrage function between gold and silver, were to be the door for accepting all the recently mined gold into their monetary system. And what you see in the starting with the gold findings in California and Australia is a dramatic recomposition of the monetary supplies. So what you see is, this is data by Flandreau here, you see an enormous increase in gold in circulation and a dramatic decrease in silver in circulation. That was certainly good as far as gold was concerned, but it posed a big problem as far as silver was concerned, simply because silver was needed, but it started leaving the country, and all the small coins were made out of silver. The only solution then was for the bimetallic countries to reduce the fineness of the silver coin, which effectively meant turning full-bodied silver coins into token coins. And that was done for all of the coins, with the exception of the 5 franc piece. So the 5 franc piece was the only coin which retained the link to the bimetallic system. So it was bimetallism based on one coin only, if you like. And I think this is quite crucial in understanding the Latin Monetary Union, which I know will also be part of some of the next presentations. I don't think one should see the LMU as a full-blown commitment to bimetallism. Rather, I would see it as a compromise between 4 players, 3 of which want to move to gold already at this stage, and 1 player which is hesitant for a couple of reasons. Flandreau has put forward the argument that actually bimetallism worked wonderfully well at that time, but you see, I see very little evidence for that. And obviously the strongest piece of evidence is the fact that they called all these commissions. Rather, I would go along with the old story of Willis or the new story of Einaudi, that it was a very complex political economy which kept the French political establishment, as it were, committed to bimetallism, even if the desire to change to gold increased over time, as I will show in a second. Now that obviously is the question, why then did Italy, Belgium and Switzerland accept the Latin Monetary Union if they actually wanted to move to gold? Well, the first reason is the link to bimetallism was weakened further with the 1865 agreement, and in fact it consisted of only one single coin, as I indicated earlier. And secondly, what these three countries, all of which were smaller and some much smaller than France, wanted was to continue with having a monetary system in alignment with the main trading partner, i.e. France. And at the same time, when you look at the details, it was a bimetallism in 1865 which came at very little cost to Switzerland, Italy and Belgium. They could exit any time they wanted to the gold standard, which is exactly what happened in the 1870s. So the key point here is, I don't think we should see the LMU as a big bimetallic project. Rather, different players have different interests. It's a compromise not untypical for monetary systems, and a compromise with a view towards entering the gold standard. How about France? I could speak hours about the French case. It's fairly well studied. Let me just boil that down to one slide. What you see in the French case in the 1860s, yes, there is resistance to go over to gold, but support for gold keeps increasing over time, and that is simply because the malfunctioning of bimetallism becomes clearer by the day. So we have here, so this is data which shows you the result of the three commissions as well as survey data from the two surveys they made in 1868. So this third commission was just republished by Georges here. And what you see is this gives you the number of people in the final vote in favor of gold monometallism. And you see that, you have more than 60% here. The tax collectors, they have more than 80% are supporting transition to gold. So it's a kind of increasing over time in these commissions. And when you look at the last report, which is a report from 1870, even though it was only published in 1872 because of the Franco-Prussian War, you find a couple of interesting statements, one of which I've shown you here. So if you look down here, you very clearly see the sense that everyone knows the world is moving towards gold, and in particular, the German states might be moving towards gold, and France gets terribly worried over the idea that they might be left with a lot of depreciated silver. Now, what is important to keep in mind here is the following. This is a statement before the Franco-Prussian War, okay? And for those of you more acquainted with the discussion on the events, is that Flandreau in particular has written a big story about the Franco-Prussian War. I cannot see that. This is before the Franco-Prussian War, and already then you have these discussions of who will dump silver on whom. So in some sense, what you see in the late 1860s is a question of who is moving quicker to gold and who will be the last one who has to live with depreciated silver. So this is as far as the bimetallic countries are concerned. And then, of course, the next question is actually what happens in the silver standard countries in the 1860s. Well, we also see a movement in favor of gold monometallism, but for slightly different reasons, of course. The goal is identical. What the silver countries want to do is they want to adopt the French system of coinage without this link to bimetallism. One more word about England. Well, if everything had been about England, why is there not a single continental European country that is willing to go over to English coinage? What you see in the 1860s is they want to take the French system, the advantages of it, without what people see also disadvantage, and that was to have silver coins as full-bodied coins. You have that in a very similar rationale in monetary commissions in Austria-Hungary, 1867, in Romania, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. key here is all these commissions are before the Germans go over to gold in 1873. So why did silver countries become increasingly interested in the gold standard? Well, the reason for that is they were actually being swarmed with gold in the 1860s. There was so much gold that a lot of the bimetallic countries paid countries that were normally on silver in gold coins. So let me show you here some data which shows you public tills in the Kingdom of Württemberg in the second half of the in the second half. So this is data from 1867, okay? And what you see here is that in these public tills, well, roughly a third was paper money, and then you have a lot of silver coin. But look at that. I mean, 1/3 of what they have in their tills is gold coins. And when you look at it more closely, actually half of that is, again, French gold coins. Okay, so these French gold coins, they develop into the big trading coins, and even the silver countries start having a lot of them in their circulation. But once they have a lot of that in their circulation, it actually creates the possibility and also the desire in the event to base your monetary system on gold. Let me say one more word about Württemberg. I mean, these kingdoms, they were then all reshuffled, but Württemberg did not have a direct border with France, which makes it even more interesting to see this vast amount of gold in circulation in one of the German states. Now, before I come to the conclusion, let me here quickly sum that up. So when you look at the German case in particular, which is a sort of better covered with 19th century sources than many of the other cases, there was lots of gold around starting in the 1860s. So they started off thinking what they can do. And actually what you will see is in the 1860s, there was more gold in circulation in the German states than silver in the vaults of the banks of note issue. So it was quite tempting to go over. Now the other ones, they are here quite straightforward. So yes, the transaction cost argument, of course, also played a role. And then you have this kind of microeconomic motivation that gold comes more handy when transactions increase. Now, let me sum that up. What is the picture that you still see in a lot of the literature, and how do I try to change it with this paper? So the conventional view is a sort of a more or less smoothly running tripolar world monetary system in the 1860s with 3 different blocks. The German 1873 decision comes out of the blue, the German decision is then explained by somehow reference to the English case. And the way I try to change that is as follows. I think what you see in the 1860s is that the support for bimetallism is withering away fairly quickly in the 1860s. And I think we need to change our understanding of the Latin Monetary Union. We should not see it as a fully bimetallic regime. It was more a bimetallic regime with a view towards an easy transition to gold monometallism. The old order is still kept alive for a couple of years, and that is because there is, in some quarters of the French political machine, still a lot of support for bimetallism. And when you then look at the decisions of the late 1860s, it is just that Germany is really one of many. It is just that we all discuss Germany because it is so much bigger than, say, Sweden or Denmark, let alone, Romania. And in that view, then, the gold transition to gold is not due to idiosyncratic circumstances, but it is a sort of the logical result of the massive gold supply shock emanating from the gold findings of Australia and California in the early 1850s, which needs some 20 years to work through the monetary system to produce a change of the global monetary system towards a unified system based on gold. Thank you very much.
We thank you for this. We start here.
Thank you, Ho. But I would like to ask, if we talk about the different nations' decision, for example, we talk about German or France, who is France or who is German? Or in other words, who is dominant in making state decision? As I said in the dinner yesterday, even the transformation of the silver standard, the gold standard in Japan, etc., I think they did not reflect even business leaders' opinion, because someone keep able to keep the business profit with the silver standard, but in spite of that, the state is going to move the gold standard. So, who made actually decision? If I may say, in Europe, they already make a framework of always some diplomacy, the influence domestic affairs, the 19th century. That is why some fashion suddenly began to activate after the 1860s. That's why it's easier to the cover the entire Europe into the gold standard. But it does not work outside Europe. That's why it takes time. Russia, Japan, or India, even the colony, they make them involved in the gold standard or gold exchange standard. So I would say who made decision in this case. I don't think the social science had this so influence in make decision.
So I take this mainly as a comment and partly as a question. I think let me go to let me go to this one here. Yes. So when did the gold standard emerge? I mean, the way I see it is that so what I mean by emergence of the gold standard is the gold standard as the dominant world monetary regime. And I think that was set in Europe for fairly obvious reasons, if you like. And I think what you needed for that was for the three main European countries to be on the gold standard. So England alone was not sufficient for that. But once Germany and France go on gold, the system is established as the dominant one. And the reason for that is that if you look at really any European country, they will always find that their main trading partners, that vastly more than 50% are conducted with the aggregate of England plus France plus Germany. And I think this is sort of what I found when I read through monetary commissions before 1873, after 1873. After 1873, it is more of a question, how do I effectuate the transition to the gold standard, and not do I really want to go over or not. This was just the dominant regime. It might still take many years to transit because you have poor public finances or for other reasons. But I think the direction is clear after 1873, whereas before 1873 it isn't, because you still have this uncertainty over what Germany and what France will do.
Yeah, but I would say, in such a transitional period, even within Germany or within France, but in the business circuit, there are the variety. Someone win more profit, but someone lose the profit with the transition of the monetary system. So I would say we talk about the state decision, they actually reflect the business circuit's opinion or not.
Okay, I think I disagree with that somewhat, actually, at least for the countries that I studied. I think there is really only one country in Europe where you have a substantial lobby that makes money from the existing regime, and that is the high finance in France. So they have a very strong interest in continuing the bimetallic system. And if you look at Rothschild, for instance, at the Rothschild Paris office, this is very clear. But if you are in a silver standard country, there are no profits you can make between gold and silver. You are currently on silver, and it is the only metal. And so the sort of, if you look into the explanations as to why the French stay on the bimetallic system until 1873, if you look at Willis, which is a very elaborate version, a treatise of the early 20th century, if you look at Einaudi, which is an elaborate treaty of the early 2000s, they will always say it was a couple of small pressure groups which kept France in the bimetallic system. And obviously you shouldn't forget that some of these people from the high finance, they were actually on the board of the Bank of France. So they were very well interconnected, and they knew how to keep it in it. But you see, for all the rest, it's a very strong movement towards gold. And I don't think there is evidence for a similar bimetallic vested interest in places like Italy, for instance, or not even Belgium.
I think that, I mean, in the background of your argument, you still have sort of a patchwork of the Reddish argument of the technological explanation for this switch, and of the Flandre argument about the fact that the country was doing this in the second moment will pay more, so that gives you an incentive to switch to gold, as you show you. So, but still, where you really want to make an argument is on the political economy field, and there, I really think that you should. I really think the suggestion that Professor Kuroda is giving you is very important here, because it's really hard to disentangle between to keep the political economy dimension on a national country level, because as you said, there is one lobby that is for bimetallism, and it is the French high finance. But high finance, I mean, for definition, is international. I mean, Rothschild is in the UK and is very well influential in the UK as well as in France. And you have other people in France and Belgium, other bankers which are rivals to the Rothschilds, that are pressing for monometallism for exactly the main reason. And one person, for example, is a guy called Ludwig Bamberger, who is one of the responsible for the reform in Germany, and who is a family member of the Bischofsheim-Goldschmidt banking dynasty, which is a rival to the Rothschild. So, I mean, the political story, economic story here is very complicated. And you really understand this if you look at the debate, not only at the end of the 60s, but also at the beginning of the 50s, when you see more or less the same authors debating the same question. And the interesting thing is that at that time, people that are arguing for gold in the 60s, in the early 50s, they argue for silver. And one extraordinary example of this is Michel Chevalier in France, which is a very influential economist at that time. So here we don't have a question of gold or silver in a technological Reddish style, I would say, explanation, but rather we have a story of who is in favor of bimetallism and who is in favor of monometallism for reasons that are maybe tied to distributional effects like inflation, deflation, and so on, or maybe more down to earth, tied to business interests like Rothschild's, non-Rothschild's interests.
So I'm also taking this more as a comment than a question, really. I don't think that I go along so much with the Reddish argument, and perhaps that in the paper that comes out clearer than here because here I didn't really mention it. I think the technological issue of producing token coinage that is safe against counterfeiting, that is settled earlier in the 19th century. And probably Reddish actually underestimates how early it was settled, but I think we have one of the specialists for that here in the room who will present a bit later. I think with the high finance, you have to see, yes, that is an important argument. It doesn't hold for everyone. But the important thing is, the only place where you can make money out of the bimetallic system is France. Bamberger cannot make money out of it because he's basically based in Germany. So well, yes, but but Bamberger was not quite the player of Rothschild's size. But I think the other point you made is actually very much in line with what I'm saying in the paper. There is nothing specifically good about gold, neither is about silver. And as you say, you have a lot of people in the 1850s who are in favor of silver, changed their mind in the 1860s. But what that shows is that this is not an argument about a specific metal. It's an argument about their relative quantities. And as it develops in the 1860s, gold was available in the right quantity, neither too much to be inflationary, nor too little to not allow a transition to the gold standard of many countries. In the event, it still turned out too many transited to gold too quickly, which is why we see the deflationary period from 1873 to, let's say, the mid-1890s or something of that sort. But the way I read it is that, you see, if you have a monetary system which you want to have based on a commodity, and that was a 19th century concept, you basically look for the quantities available. And they were determined by what happened in California and Australia, and not so much by ideology, as it is sometimes said by people like Gallaroti or De Cecco, for instance.
Yeah, to come back to your last point, I also think indeed that the Gallaroti argument should definitely not be overstated. I think it's the ideology thing is just, I think it's just a little bit too short for the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But again, I do have, and this is maybe not so much a comment, but really a question for you. When it's really about the supply of a metal, then you would expect, at least towards the end of the 19th century, again a turn to silver, or at least to bimetallism. And you do find that, for instance, in Japan, whereas there are more people in favor of bimetallism, although that part, the bimetalist party, is actually overruled by the government because they want to buy warships in England. So I do think actually the main problem with the argument, I feel, is that we should not mix up gold as a commodity with gold as money. That is, I think it's crucial in understanding that. You do not only choose a metal because there is more quantity. The profits change when this kind of thing happens. You get a deflation or inflationary effect according to amounts of money, amounts of metal circulating in the economy. So I would like to hear something about that as well.
I will try to give an answer in two steps. So the first one is you referred to the deflationary period of the 1870s and 80s, which gave rise to the international bimetallic movement. And I think the main reason why so there are two reasons why the bimetallic movement does not succeed. One of which is a kind of classical prisoner's dilemma coordination problem. The financially strong and sound countries, such as the UK and Germany, they say, well, if you want to have an international bimetallic thing, that's fine with us, but we will not take part in it. Which gives the bimetallic movement a sort of a bad reputation, so no one is willing to commit unless everyone commits. The typical prisoner's dilemma thing. And the second reason why the movement why the movement fails, and I mean they had 3 conferences in 78, 81, 92, is that gold is being found in South Africa in 1887, and it is the entry of the South African gold into the world monetary system which puts an end to deflation in most countries in the mid-1890s, and then the problem goes away. Now, to make your point, gold as commodity, gold as money, I think you always see that, you see the the quantities plays a crucial role, and you very clearly see that after World War I, when countries want to go back to the gold standard. So what was the problem of World War I? Well, the legacy of World War I from a monetary system perspective was that gold, by definition, hadn't increased a lot during these 4 years, but countries needed to finance World War I by inflation, so you have much more money after World War I. And now you cannot go back to the old system. And then there are two solutions found. Well, countries do not repack at the old parity, with the exception of a small number of countries. And the second way to find a solution to that is, of course, to call for the introduction of the gold exchange standard. The gold exchange standard, often epitomized with the call for the gold exchange standard in the Geneva conference, is a result to increase liquidity to make the gold standard workable in a world in which there's actually not enough physical gold. So you have to bring in the reserves, and of course the irony of this system happens 7 years later or 9 years later. When the Great Depression sets in, central banks convert their foreign reserves into gold, and basically they are thrown back to the problem which they hadn't solved after World War I, and that is, we simply have too much money and not enough gold. What do we do?